The winter wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls, and Dorothy Garfield pressed her trembling hands against her hollow stomach, knowing that her stepmother had locked the pantry again. She was 19 years old, skin stretched over bones that seemed ready to break through, her auburn hair dull and lifeless from months of deliberate starvation in this God-forsaken house on the edge of Silver City, New Mexico, where the winter of 1884 had turned brutal and unforgiving. Her father had died 6 months ago from a fever that took him in 3 days, leaving her alone with Margaret, the woman he had married only a year before. The transformation had been immediate and cruel. The moment they lowered her father into the cold ground, Margaret's false sweetness evaporated like morning dew, replaced by a calculated cruelty that Dorothy could never have imagined. The woman wanted the house, the small savings her father had accumulated, and Dorothy gone, preferably dead from natural causes that no one could trace back to deliberate malice. Dorothy lay on the thin mattress in the unheated back room, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. She had not eaten a proper meal in 4 months. Margaret gave her scraps occasionally, just enough to keep her from dying too quickly, always with a smile that never reached her cold eyes. The townspeople rarely visited, and when they did, Margaret played the part of the concerned stepmother perfectly, sighing about Dorothy's delicate constitution and poor appetite. The sun was setting on another endless day when Dorothy heard the knock at the front door. She was too weak to move, too dizzy from hunger to care who might be visiting. She heard Margaret's voice, sweet as poisoned honey, greeting someone. Then a deeper voice, masculine and unfamiliar, asking about hiring help for the spring cattle drive. "I am afraid we cannot help you," Margaret said. "My stepdaughter is quite ill, and I must devote all my time to her care." Dorothy wanted to laugh at the lie, but she had no strength even for that. The voices continued, and then she heard boots on the wooden floor, coming closer to her room. Her heart quickened with something she had not felt in months, something that might have been hope. The door opened, and Margaret stood there with a tall man behind her. He wore a worn leather jacket and a hat that shadowed his face, but Dorothy could see his eyes, dark and sharp, taking in everything about the room, taking in everything about her. "You see how she suffers," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The poor child barely eats. I try everything, but she refuses food." The man said nothing for a long moment. Then he stepped into the room and Dorothy could see him properly. He was perhaps 24 or 25, with strong features weathered by sun and wind, a jaw that looked carved from granite, and those eyes that seemed to see straight through Margaret's performance to the truth beneath. "What is your name?" he asked Dorothy directly, ignoring Margaret completely. "Dorothy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am Jackson Forrester," he said. "I work at the Double Creek Ranch about 5 miles north of town. We are looking for someone to help with cooking and mending for the spring season. The pay is fair and the work is honest." Margaret laughed, a brittle sound. "As I said, she is far too ill for such work." Jackson turned to look at Margaret, and something in his expression made the older woman take a step back. "I was not asking you," he said quietly. "I was offering the lady a job if she wants it." Dorothy tried to sit up, but the room spun violently. Jackson moved quickly, catching her before she fell. His hands were warm and strong, and she could smell leather and soap and something else, something clean and good that made her want to cry. "She needs a doctor," Jackson said, his voice hard as iron. "I have provided everything she needs," Margaret protested. "She simply will not cooperate with treatment." Jackson looked down at Dorothy, and she saw anger flash in his eyes, quickly controlled. "Miss Garfield, if you can hear me, blink twice if you want help." Dorothy blinked twice, then twice again, desperate to make him understand. "Right," Jackson said. He stood, lifting Dorothy as if she weighed nothing at all. "I am taking her to Dr. Chen in town." Margaret moved to block the door. "You cannot simply abduct my stepdaughter from her own home. I will have the sheriff on you." "Please do," Jackson said calmly. "I am sure Sheriff Morrison would be very interested to know why your stepdaughter looks like she has not eaten in months, while you look quite well fed yourself." He brushed past Margaret, carrying Dorothy through the house and out into the cold evening air. The ride to town was a blur of pain and cold and the steady rhythm of a horse's gait. Jackson held her carefully, wrapped in his own coat, murmuring reassurances that she could barely hear over the roaring in her ears. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of warmth and safety and the firm strength of the arms that held her. Dr. Chen was a Chinese man who had come west with the railroad workers and stayed to practice medicine in Silver City. He took one look at Dorothy and began barking orders to his assistant. Jackson laid her gently on the examination table and stepped back, but he did not leave. "How long?" Dr. Chen asked, his accent slight but his English perfect. "I do not know," Jackson said, "but long enough, too long." Dorothy felt hands examining her, professional and gentle. Dr. Chen spoke quietly to his assistant in Cantonese, and she heard the scrape of jars being opened, the clink of spoons against cups. Then warm broth was being spooned carefully into her mouth, and Dr. Chen was telling her to swallow slowly, very slowly. "Her stomach has shrunk," the doctor explained to Jackson. "Too much food too fast will kill her as surely as starvation. She must eat small amounts many times a day and only certain foods at first. She needs warmth, rest, and time. Several weeks at minimum, more likely months, before she will be strong again." "She will have it," Jackson said firmly. "That woman at the house," Dr. Chen said carefully. "She did this deliberately, yes." "Yes," Jackson said. The doctor nodded slowly. "I will speak to the sheriff. This is attempted murder no matter how it is disguised." Dorothy wanted to protest, to say that it would only make things worse, but she was so tired and the broth was warm in her stomach, and for the first time in months she felt safe. She let her eyes close and drifted into real sleep, not the half-conscious stupor of starvation. When she woke, she was in a bed that was not her own, in a room that smelled of pine and wood smoke. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, and she could hear voices somewhere in the house, low and calm. She turned her head slowly, fighting the dizziness, and saw Jackson sitting in a chair beside the bed, his hat on his knee, watching her. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My mother's house," he said. "Dr. Chen said you needed round-the-clock care and the boarding house in town was full. My mother offered, and here we are." "Your mother? She is downstairs making you bone broth," Jackson said with a slight smile. "Fair warning, she is formidable. She has been cooking for the ranch hands for 30 years, and she does not take no for an answer when it comes to feeding people." Dorothy felt tears sliding down her temples. "Why are you helping me? You do not even know me." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "My father died when I was 12, he said finally. "Left my mother with me and my 3 sisters and not much else. People in this town helped us when they did not have to. Gave my mother work, brought us food, made sure we had firewood for the winter. I learned that sometimes helping someone is not about knowing them. It is about being human." The door opened, and a woman in her 50s entered, carrying a tray. She had Jackson's dark eyes and a face that was stern until she smiled, and then it was warm as summer sunshine. "So you are awake," she said briskly. "Good. I am Jackson Forrester, and you are going to eat this broth slowly, while I tell you the rules of this house." Dorothy could not help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Yes, madam." Catherine set the tray across Dorothy's lap and began spooning broth into her mouth as if she were a child. "You will eat 6 times a day, small amounts," she said firmly. "You will rest when you are tired, which will be often at first. You will not try to help with chores until Dr. Chen says you are strong enough. You will accept help without arguing, because pride is a luxury you cannot currently afford. Do you understand?" "Yes, madam," Dorothy said again, and the broth was rich and good, coating her throat and settling warmly in her stomach. Over the following days, Dorothy learned the rhythms of the Forrester household. Catherine ruled with efficient kindness, appearing at regular intervals with food and medicine, clean nightgowns and fresh linens. Jackson came every evening after working at the ranch, sitting in the chair beside her bed, telling her stories about the cattle and the other ranch hands, the wild horses in the hills and the eagles that nested in the canyon. He never pressed her to talk about what had happened, never asked questions that might cause her pain. He simply filled the silence with his presence, steady and undemanding. Sheriff Morrison came to take her statement, a grizzled man with kind eyes and a notebook that he wrote in carefully. Dorothy told him everything, from her father's death to the locked pantry to the deliberate starvation that had nearly killed her. The sheriff nodded grimly and said that Margaret had already left town, vanished in the night with whatever cash she could grab, leaving the house abandoned. "The property is yours," he said. "Your father's will was clear on that. Once you are well, you can decide what you want to do with it." Dorothy did not know what to feel about that. The house held too many bad memories now, but it had been her childhood home, the place where her mother had died giving birth to her, where her father had raised her with love and patience. She pushed the thoughts away and focused on the immediate task of surviving each day, of eating the small meals Catherine prepared, of sleeping when her body demanded it, of slowly, painfully, coming back to life. After 2 weeks, Dr. Chen declared her strong enough to sit up for longer periods. After 3 weeks, she could walk from the bed to the chair and back again without fainting. After 4 weeks, Catherine announced that she could come downstairs for meals, and Dorothy cried with relief and gratitude. The kitchen was large and warm, with a cookstove that radiated heat and windows that looked out over a small garden. Jackson was there, washing up after the day's work, and he smiled when he saw her standing in the doorway. "Look at you," he said. "Steady on your feet and everything." "Do not get too excited," Dorothy said, letting Catherine guide her to a chair at the long wooden table. "I walked downstairs. I did not rope a steer." Jackson laughed, and the sound was rich and genuine. "Give it time. You will be roping steers by summer." They ate together, the 3 of them, and Dorothy felt something warm and fragile blooming in her chest. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Safe and warm and full of laughter. Not the cold silence and constant fear that had filled her father's house after Margaret arrived. As the weeks passed, Dorothy grew stronger. Color returned to her cheeks, flesh to her bones. Her hair regained its shine, and her eyes lost the dull glaze of starvation. She began helping Catherine with small tasks, peeling vegetables and folding laundry, needing to feel useful after so long being helpless. Catherine pretended to protest, but let her help anyway, always watching to make sure she did not overtax herself. Jackson came home every evening, and Dorothy found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch, the way he would call out a greeting as he entered. They fell into an easy companionship, talking about everything and nothing, and Dorothy realized with a mix of wonder and terror that she was falling in love with him. It seemed impossible, given everything she had been through, but her heart did not care about logic or timing. It only knew that Jackson made her feel safe and valued, that his smile could brighten her darkest moments, that his presence had quite literally saved her life. One evening in early April, when the winter cold had finally broken and wildflowers were beginning to bloom on the hillsides, Jackson asked her to walk with him. They went slowly, mindful of her still recovering strength, following a path that led to a small rise overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the air smelled of sage and new grass. "I have been thinking," Jackson said, staring out at the horizon, "about the future, about what I want from life." Dorothy's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "And what do you want?" He turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "I want a home of my own, a family, someone to build a life with." He paused, then continued softly. "I want you, Dorothy, if you will have me." She had imagined this moment, lying awake at night, but the reality was so much more overwhelming than any fantasy. "Jackson, I have nothing to offer you. No dowry, no prospects, just a haunted house and bad memories." "You have yourself," he said firmly. "That is everything I want. I am not asking because I pity you or because I feel obligated. I am asking because over these past months, I have watched you fight your way back from the edge of death with more courage than I have seen in soldiers. I have talked with you every evening and found myself counting the hours until I could see you again. I have fallen in love with your strength, your kindness, your terrible sense of humor that makes my mother laugh. I love you, Dorothy Garfield, and I want to marry you if you will have me." Dorothy felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in so long they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Jackson pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she were something precious and fragile. She rested her head against his chest and heard the steady beat of his heart, and she knew that she was finally, truly safe. They told Catherine that evening, and she cried and hugged them both, declaring that she had known all along and had simply been waiting for her son to stop being dense and do something about it. They decided to wait until Dorothy was completely well before marrying, wanting to start their life together when she was strong and healthy, not still recovering from trauma. The months that followed were the happiest Dorothy had ever known. She continued to grow stronger, helping Catherine more and more with the household work, learning to cook the hearty meals that fed the ranch hands, mending clothes and tending the garden. Jackson courted her properly, bringing her wildflowers and taking her on careful rides across the range eland, showing her the hidden canyons and secret springs that dotted the landscape. In June, Sheriff Morrison came to tell her that Margaret had been found in Arizona, arrested for trying to poison another stepdaughter in a similar scheme. She would hang for murder, as the other girl had not been as fortunate as Dorothy. Dorothy felt a complex mix of emotions, relief and anger and sorrow for the life that woman might have lived if she had chosen differently. But mostly, she felt grateful that justice had been served and that she could close that chapter of her life forever. In July, when the summer heat shimmered off the desert floor and the cattle grazed in the high meadows, Dorothy and Jackson were married in the small church in Silver City. Catherine stood up with her, and Jackson's 3 sisters came from various parts of the territory, bringing their husbands and children. The church was full of people from the town and the ranch, all of them celebrating the union of 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds. Dorothy wore a simple white dress that Catherine had made, with wildflowers in her hair and a smile that felt like it might split her face in 2. Jackson wore a new suit that looked uncomfortable but made him devastatingly handsome, and when he said his vows, his voice was strong and clear and full of love. They bought her father's house from the estate, spending weeks cleaning and renovating, exorcising the ghosts of her stepmother's cruelty with fresh paint and new furniture and laughter that filled every room. They moved in at the end of summer, and Dorothy planted roses in the front garden, reclaiming the space for beauty and life. Jackson continued working at the Double Creek Ranch, and Dorothy took in sewing and baking, selling her goods in town and building a reputation for quality work. They were not rich, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, they were happy. Every evening, Jackson came home to find Dorothy waiting, and they would sit on the porch together, watching the sunset and talking about their day, their dreams, their future. In the spring of 1886, Dorothy discovered she was pregnant. She told Jackson one evening over dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He went very still, his fork halfway to his mouth, and then a smile broke across his face like sunrise. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as I can be," she said. "Dr. Chen confirmed it this morning." Jackson pushed his chair back and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "Dorothy, we are going to be parents." She laughed against his chest. "That is generally how it works, yes." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Dorothy bloomed with health, all traces of her starvation long gone. Catherine fussed over her constantly, making sure she ate properly and rested enough, sharing advice from her own pregnancies. Jackson was simultaneously terrified and thrilled, reading every book about childbirth he could find and driving Dorothy slightly crazy with his hovering. In December, when the winter cold had returned, but nowhere near as brutal as that terrible winter 2 years before, Dorothy went into labor. Catherine and Dr. Chen were there, coaching her through the pain, and Jackson paced outside the room like a caged animal, driving himself half-mad with worry. After 12 hours of labor, Dorothy gave birth to a healthy baby boy with a strong set of lungs and his father's dark eyes. Jackson came into the room, looking terrified, and Dr. Chen placed the baby in his arms. The expression on Jackson's face made Dorothy cry all over again. Love and wonder and fierce protectiveness all mixed together. "He is perfect," Jackson whispered. "Dorothy, he is perfect." They named him Thomas William Forrester, after both their fathers, and he became the center of their world. Jackson proved to be a devoted father, waking for night feedings and changing diapers without complaint, singing off key lullabies that made Dorothy laugh and the baby settle contentedly. The years flowed by with the rhythm of ranch life and the changing seasons. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic toddler who followed his father everywhere and climbed everything he could reach. In 1888, Dorothy gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Catherine, after Jackson's mother, who cried when she heard and declared it was the finest gift anyone had ever given her. Sarah had her mother's auburn hair and her father's stubborn determination, and she kept them all on their toes. In 1890, their third child arrived, another boy they named Henry, who was quiet and thoughtful from birth, content to sit and observe the chaos around him with wide, serious eyes. Their house rang with laughter and occasional tears, with the thunder of small feet and the chaos of family meals. It was everything Dorothy had never dared to dream of during those dark winter months when she had been slowly dying. Jackson expanded his work, eventually becoming foreman of the Double Creek Ranch and then, through careful saving and hard work, buying a small piece of land adjoining Dorothy's family property. He built up his own herd, modest at first but growing steadily, and by 1895 they were prosperous enough to hire help themselves. Dorothy continued her sewing business, now with a reputation that extended beyond Silver City, and between them they built a life of stability and comfort. But more than the material success, They built a life filled with love. They never forgot those early days, the darkness that Dorothy had survived, the miracle of their meeting. Jackson still told her he loved her every single day, still brought her wildflowers from the range, still looked at her with the same wonder he had shown when he first carried her out of that house of horrors. Dorothy still marveled at the twist of fate that had brought him to her door at exactly the right moment, still felt overwhelming gratitude for his kindness and strength. On their 10th wedding anniversary in July of 1895, they stood on the same rise where he had proposed, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. Their children were with Catherine for the evening, giving them rare time alone. Dorothy leaned against Jackson's side, his arm warm around her shoulders. "You remember the first time we stood here?" Jackson asked. "I remember being terrified," Dorothy admitted. "Terrified that I was dreaming, that I would wake up back in that cold room with my stepmother locking the pantry again. And now," she turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life and then given her a reason to live it fully. "Now I know it is real, all of this. Our children, our home, our life together. It is real and it is good, and I am grateful for every single day." Jackson kissed her gently. "I am the grateful one. You gave me everything I ever wanted, Dorothy. A partner, a family, a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me joy." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Below them, lights flickered on in their house, warm and welcoming. Smoke rose from the chimney, and they could hear the distant sound of their children laughing at something Catherine had said. Dorothy thought back to that terrible winter, to the girl she had been, starving and hopeless and utterly alone. She thought about the day Jackson had walked into her room and refused to accept Margaret's lies, the day he had lifted her up and carried her to safety. She thought about all the small moments since then, the careful spoonfuls of broth, the patient conversations, the steady building of trust and then love. Her life had been saved not once but many times over. Saved from starvation, yes, but also saved from loneliness, from despair, from the belief that she was not worthy of love and care. Jackson had fed her back to strength, but he had done so much more than that. He had shown her what it meant to be valued, to be cherished, to be an equal partner in building a life in the years that followed. Their family continued to grow and thrive. Thomas grew into a fine young man who loved working with cattle as much as his father did, eventually taking over much of the ranch work as Jackson's hair began to gray. Sarah became a teacher, opening a small school in Silver City and marrying a banker's son who adored her fierce intelligence. Henry surprised them all by discovering a talent for engineering, leaving for college in the East, and sending long letters describing the marvels of modern technology. Catherine lived to see all her grandchildren grown, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by the family she had helped nurture. Her funeral was attended by half the territory, testament to the lives she had touched and the kindness she had shown. Dorothy and Jackson grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1935, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, the house bursting with family and laughter. Dorothy looked at Jackson across the crowded room, his hair white now, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind, and she felt the same flutter in her heart that she had felt at 19 when he had asked her to marry him. That evening, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, they sat on the porch together as they had done thousands of times before. The night was warm and the stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any city lights. "You ever regret it?" Dorothy asked. stopping at that house that day, taking on a half-dead girl and all the complications that came with her. Jackson took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that plagued his joints. "Not for one single moment," he said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Dorothy Forrester. Then, now, and always." She squeezed his hand back, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. After all these years, he could still make her feel like the most precious thing in the world. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting and good. A life forged from the ashes of tragedy, a love born from the simple act of one human being choosing to help another, and a family that would carry their legacy forward for generations to come. Dorothy had been starved nearly to death in the cruel winter of 1884, weak and hopeless and alone. Jackson had fed her back to strength with broth and bread and patience, and most importantly, with love. But the feeding had never really stopped. Every day of their marriage, they had fed each other, nourishing not just bodies but souls, building each other up, supporting each other through hardships and celebrating each triumph together. That was the real miracle, Dorothy thought as she sat there in the darkness with her husband's hand in hers. Not just that she had survived, but that she had found a love so deep and true that it had sustained her through 50 years and would sustain her until the very end. A love that had started with a cowboy who refused to accept cruelty, who had carried a dying girl to safety, and who had proven every day since that he had meant his wedding vows with every fiber of his being. The stars continued their ancient dance overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Dorothy closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of sage and desert flowers, of the roses she had planted all those years ago to reclaim her father's house from darkness. She breathed in the scent of home and love and safety, and she knew that despite everything, despite the cruelty she had endured and the darkness she had survived, her life had been blessed beyond measure. Jackson shifted beside her, and she opened her eyes to find him watching her with that same expression of quiet devotion that he had worn since the beginning. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said softly. "Our whole life together. How lucky I am, how grateful." "The luck was mine," he said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "Always mine." They sat together until the moon rose high above the mountains, painting the desert in silver light. Eventually, they rose stiffly from their chairs and went inside, closing the door on the night but not on their memories, never on those. The house embraced them with warmth and familiar comfort, every room holding echoes of laughter and love, every corner a testament to the life they had built together. Dorothy prepared for bed with the ease of long habit, and Jackson helped her with buttons that her arthritic fingers struggled with, just as she helped him with the tasks that had become difficult for him. They climbed into bed, the same bed they had shared for 50 years, and Jackson pulled her close, her head resting on his shoulder as it had for half a century. "I love you, Dorothy Forrester," he murmured into the darkness. "I love you, Jackson Forrester," she replied, as she had replied countless times before and would reply countless times more. They fell asleep together, secure in each other's arms, two souls who had found each other against impossible odds and had built a love that had withstood every test. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of sage and rain, and all the wild beauty of the land they had made their home. Inside, two hearts beat in steady rhythm, a melody of love and devotion that would play on until the very end and beyond, echoing through the generations they had created, a legacy of kindness and strength and the transformative power of choosing to love. The years continued to pass gently after that golden anniversary, each season bringing its own quiet joys. Dorothy and Jackson settled into the peaceful rhythm of old age, their days slower but no less full. They tended their garden together, Dorothy pointing out which plants needed water while Jackson did the heavier work, both of them moving with the careful deliberation of those who had earned their rest, but were not quite ready to stop living. Their children visited often, Thomas coming by almost daily to check on them and help with repairs around the house, Sarah bringing her grandchildren to hear stories about the old days, Henry returning from the East several times a year with gifts and tales of the modern world that was rapidly changing beyond the quiet corner of New Mexico they called home. The house was never truly empty, always filled with the comings and goings of family, and Dorothy thrived on it, her face lighting up every time she heard footsteps on the porch. Jackson's health began to decline first, his strong body finally succumbing to the decades of hard physical labor. He developed a persistent cough that Dr. Chen's successor could not quite cure, and his joints ached more on cold mornings. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Dorothy never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger, more tender, as if he were trying to pour a lifetime of devotion into every remaining moment. One morning in the spring of 1937, Dorothy woke to find Jackson watching her, his eyes soft in the early light filtering through the curtains. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Good morning, you old charmer," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "How are you feeling?" "Lucky," he said simply. "Every morning I wake up next to you I feel lucky." They rose slowly and made their way to the kitchen, where Dorothy prepared a simple breakfast while Jackson sat at the table and read the newspaper, commenting on stories that caught his attention. It was a scene they had played out thousands of times, comfortable and familiar, and Dorothy cherished every moment of it. That afternoon, Thomas stopped by with his wife and their youngest son, a boy of 8 who was Jackson's special favorite. They sat on the porch together, Jackson telling stories about breaking wild horses and driving cattle through summer storms, the boy hanging on every word. Dorothy watched from the doorway, her heart full almost to bursting with love for this man who had given her such a beautiful life. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in those familiar shades of gold and crimson, Jackson called Dorothy over to sit beside him. The others had gone inside to prepare dinner, leaving them alone in the warm evening air. He took her hand, his grip weaker than it once had been but still sure. "I have been thinking," he said, his eyes on the horizon, "about that day I found you, how close I came to not stopping at your house at all. I almost rode straight past, you know. I was in a hurry to get back to the ranch. But something made me stop, some instinct or fate or divine intervention, I do not know what, but I am grateful for it every day of my life." Dorothy leaned her head on his shoulder. "I am grateful too. You saved my life, Jackson, in every way that matters." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "You gave my life meaning, Dorothy, purpose. You made me better than I was." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade from the sky. Dorothy felt a strange tightness in her chest, a premonition she could not quite name. She squeezed Jackson's hand tighter, and he squeezed back, and for a moment, time seemed to stop, holding them suspended in that perfect moment of peace and love and togetherness. Jackson lived 3 more years, his body growing frailer but his spirit remaining strong. He died peacefully in January of 1940 in their bed, with Dorothy holding his hand and their children gathered around. His last words were, "I love you," directed at Dorothy with all the fierce devotion he had shown her for 55 years. She kissed him one last time and whispered, "I love you too. Thank you for everything." The funeral was enormous, testament to the life Jackson had lived and the people he had touched. Dorothy stood at the graveside, supported by her children, and watched as they lowered her husband into the ground. She did not cry, not yet. There would be time for tears later, in the long nights ahead when she reached for him and found only empty space. For now, she stood straight and proud, honoring the man who had shown her what love truly meant. Dorothy lived for another 8 years without Jackson, surrounded by family but achingly aware of his absence. She kept the house exactly as it had been, his favorite chair still positioned by the window, his books still on the shelf, his presence lingering in every room. She tended the garden they had planted together and sat on the porch every evening, watching the sunset and remembering all the times they had watched it together. Her children worried about her living alone, but she refused to move, insisting that she was fine, that she had her memories and her garden and the comfort of the home she and Jackson had built together. And she was fine in her way. Lonely, yes, and grieving, but also content in the knowledge that she had been blessed with a love that most people only dreamed of. In the summer of 1948, Dorothy developed pneumonia. Dr. Chen's grandson, now running the medical practice, came to treat her, but she waved away his concerns. She was 83 years old and she was tired. She had lived a full life, rich with love and family and purpose. She was ready. On a warm evening in July, with the roses blooming in her garden and the scent of desert flowers drifting through the open window, Dorothy Forrester passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was buried next to Jackson, their headstones side by side, united in death as they had been in life. At the funeral, Thomas stood to speak about his mother, his voice breaking with emotion as he told the story of how his parents had met, how his father had saved his mother's life, and how she had saved his in return. He spoke of the love that had sustained them through good times and bad, of the family they had built and the legacy they had left. When he finished, there was not a dry eye in the church. The house passed to Thomas, who maintained it with the same care his parents had shown, keeping the garden thriving and the roses blooming. He told his own children and grandchildren the story of Dorothy and Jackson, making sure they understood where they came from and what kind of love had created their family. It became a legend of sorts, passed down through generations, the tale of the cowboy who saved the starving girl and the love that grew from that act of simple human kindness. The property remained in the Forrester family for generations, each new owner adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation that Dorothy and Jackson had laid. The house became a gathering place, a symbol of family and endurance, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest circumstances. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind whispered through the canyon, and the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, those who sat on that old porch swore they could feel the presence of two souls, still together, still watching over the family they had created, still bound by a love that death itself could not diminish. The story of Dorothy and Jackson became more than just family history. It became a reminder that even in the cruelest of circumstances, kindness could flourish, that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, and that a single moment of compassion could change not just one life but generations to follow. Their great-great-grandchildren would stand on that same rise where Jackson had proposed, looking out over the valley that had witnessed so much history, and they would feel the weight of that legacy. They would remember that they came from stock that valued loyalty and love above all else, that chose kindness even when the world was cruel, that built something lasting from the ashes of tragedy. The roses Dorothy planted continued to bloom every summer, generation after generation, hardy and beautiful, surviving drought and frost, and the passage of time. They became a symbol of Dorothy herself, of her strength and resilience, of the way she had taken root in this harsh land and not just survived but flourished, creating beauty where there had been only pain. In the town of Silver City, the story was remembered too. The old-timers would tell newcomers about Jackson Forrester, who had defied convention to save a dying girl from her cruel stepmother, and about Dorothy Garfield, who had survived starvation and built a life of purpose and love. Their story became part of the town's identity, a reminder of the values that had built the West, not just the violence and lawlessness that dominated the popular imagination, but the quiet acts of heroism, the daily choices to help rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. The house itself became a landmark, not officially but in the hearts of the people who knew its history. Young couples would walk past it and dream of finding a love like Dorothy and Jackson had shared. Parents would point it out to their children and tell them about the importance of kindness and courage. It stood as a testament to the fact that happy endings were possible, even when circumstances seemed impossibly dark. As the 20th century progressed, and the world changed in ways that Dorothy and Jackson could never have imagined, their story remained constant, an anchor to simpler truths. Technology advanced, wars were fought, society transformed, but the fundamental human needs for love and safety and belonging remained unchanged. Dorothy and Jackson's story spoke to those needs, reminded people of what truly mattered beneath all the noise and chaos of modern life. Their descendants carried the story forward, each generation adding their own understanding and interpretation, but keeping the core intact. They spoke of how Jackson had fed Dorothy back to strength, not just with food but with patience and respect and unwavering support. They spoke of how Dorothy had given Jackson purpose and joy, transforming his life as surely as he had saved hers. They spoke of a partnership built on mutual care and devotion, a love that had started in the darkest of circumstances and grown into something radiant and enduring. The story was told at weddings, offered as inspiration and guidance to new couples embarking on their own journeys. It was told at funerals, comfort for those grieving and reminder that love transcends death. It was told around dinner tables and campfires, passed from grandparent to grandchild, a precious inheritance more valuable than any material wealth. And always, at the heart of the story, was that moment of choice. The moment when Jackson Forrester looked at a dying girl and decided that her life mattered, that she deserved help, that he would not turn away from suffering when he had the power to alleviate it. That single decision had cascaded forward through time, creating ripples that touched hundreds of lives. It was a reminder that every choice mattered, that individual actions had power, that one person could make a difference. The legacy of Dorothy and Jackson Forrester was not just their descendants or their property, or even their story. It was the values they had lived by, the love they had nurtured, the kindness they had shown not just to each other but to everyone who crossed their path. They had taken the cruelty and suffering that the world had handed them and transformed it into something beautiful and lasting. They had proven that darkness did not have to win, that love could conquer even the deepest despair, that there was always hope for those brave enough to reach for it. As the years stretched into decades and the decades into generations, the story remained alive, changing slightly with each telling but keeping its essential truth intact. Dorothy Garfield had been starved nearly to death by her cruel stepmother in the brutal winter of 1884. Jackson Forrester had carried her to safety and fed her back to strength. They had fallen in love and built a life together that became the foundation for generations to come. It was a simple story in many ways, but it contained multitudes, speaking to the best of what humans could be when they chose compassion over cruelty, love over indifference, hope over despair. And in the end, that was the real happy ending. Not just that Dorothy and Jackson had found each other and lived long, full lives together, but that their love had created something that outlasted them both, a legacy that would endure as long as there were people to remember and retell their story. They had built something that mattered, something that made the world a little bit better, a little bit kinder, a little bit more full of love. They had proved that even the darkest winter could give way to spring, that even the most broken person could be made whole again. That love, real love, the kind that fed not just bodies but souls, was the most powerful force in the world. Their story ended, as all stories must, but it also continued, carried forward in the hearts and lives of those who came after. An eternal testament to the transformative power of choosing kindness, of refusing to accept cruelty, of believing that every life has value and every person deserves a chance at happiness. Dorothy and Jackson Forrester had lived and loved and died, but their legacy lived on, immortal as the stars that wheeled overhead, constant as the desert wind that whispered through the canyons, enduring as the roses that bloomed each summer in the garden where their love had first taken root and flourished.